I believe every child can learn. Facilitating growth mindsets, as well as identifying and reframing learned helplessness, are equally essential to ensuring positive learning outcomes for all students. Enabling learning requires teachers and schools to facilitate whole community cooperation, from policy and government level down to relationships between teachers, families and students. Every child learns in different ways at their own pace, and teachers must plan for this, as well as modelling and guiding student agency, which enables optimal learning outcomes for students. Piaget's cognitive learning theories are based on development through 4 cognitive stages, influenced by processes of maturation, activity, social interaction and equilibration. And he also believed that skills and knowledge are developed through experiential learning. In terms of metacognition, the dimensions of metacognition model by Duchenne and McMaw is underscored by Flavel's forms of metacognitive knowledge of person, of task, and of strategy, which make up and interact to create metacognitive knowledge base of the students, and metacognitive experiences, which, if positive, can contribute to students' self-efficacy over tasks. The information processing approach in this model, if we apply Baddeley's executive control system, as cited in Duchenne and McMaw, we must consider that students have limited cognitive load while engaging working memory. So limited sensory memory input must be ensured. Atkinson and Sifrin state that students can interact with imported sensory memory and use existing schema to create working memory and practice through rehearsal. They also use personal experiences of learning, like hearing working memory, according to O'Donnell, to develop knowledge, and they store this new knowledge as schema in long-term memory, according to Burns, Jaeger and Lutz. And they learn best, according to Duchenne and McMaw, by active control over cognition, so working independently and applying their executive control, as you can see here. The strengths of cognitive learning theory are that it does consider complex brain functions ignored by behaviourists, as well as Piaget's research has influenced our stage and age approaches to learning that we use today in Victoria. Information processing approaches and cognitive load theory are intertwined, considering children's limited capacity to work with sensory memory. And the multi-store model draws together concepts of children's metacognition or executive control and allows them to manage information as memory while they're learning. Next slide. In terms of linking this model to Bloom's taxonomy, students at a minimum will need to remember and understand existing schema and apply new sensory memory. And they will apply and analyse existing schema linked with sensory memory as working memory, hopefully. And in an ideal world, they will also evaluate and create new information and ideas to be stored as a schema. In terms of links to Bloom's taxonomy, further, if we're considering Baddeley's executive control model and Anderson and Krathwohl's types of knowledge from the updated Bloom's, students will draw on existing schema in the form of factual or conceptual knowledge, and they will draw on procedural and metacognitive knowledge using executive control over working memory processes. In terms of links to the Solow taxonomy, as demonstrated here by Trigg Nunno, the Solow taxonomy can guide children to be what Smith calls learning conscious, and it can also be effective in strategic use of taxonomies, or we could even use metacognitive and information processing models to facilitate students' awareness of the importance of self-assessment, self-feedback, and student agency over learning outcomes. In terms of what I would use for cognitive learning theory, I would use modelling of metacognitive behaviours like the rucksack problem-solving model that Hart has written about. I would introduce sensory memory, matching individual stages of development to avoid cognitive overload and limit that. And I would consider high-impact teaching strategies in my planning, particularly in relation to cognitive learning theory, metacognitive strategies, structuring lessons, and feedback. In terms of aspects that I wouldn't use, there aren't particularly any that I would avoid. However, I would recognise that consideration of social constructivist principles and theories would add depth and context to pedagogy in action. Cognitive development is influenced by biological growth, metacognition, and timely input of appropriate sensory memory, applied as working memory and stored as schema. However, this is not strictly an intrinsic process, and practitioners and children alike must be aware of or made aware of and consider the impact of social environments, history and culture to optimise learning, as Vygotsky suggests. In conclusion, every child can learn when growth mindsets and approaches are established and supported by systems in the classroom. Cognitive learning theory is restrictive in scope, but there is scope within the theory and modelling for student agency over learning, stage-based planning and individual metacognitive styles. Thank you for listening.